Welcome to Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball. This is Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe, talking to you once more from Brussels. This week, I'd like to talk about supply chain security. You may think this is a dry topic, but when Friends of Europe held a security jam and invited over 200 security experts 2 weeks ago to talk about the EU's response to the COVID-19 crisis, one of the biggest conclusions that emerged was that Europe needs to overhaul its supply chain security. The crisis has shown that Europe has been critically dependent on just a few countries like China for protective clothing, or Turkey, or India for medicines and pharmaceuticals. And although, yes, those supply chains have worked in terms of supplies being delivered, there have been hiccups. India, for example, temporarily banned the export of pharmaceuticals because it feared shortages at home. And some of the clothing and equipment from China and Turkey has been well below the standard vis-a-vis the price, the expensive price that EU countries have had to pay for it. And the crisis has also shown a spotlight on the lack of preparation in the EU. For instance, France, just 20 years ago, had stored nearly 2 billion face masks for just this kind of emergency, but those supplies have been allowed to dwindle today to under 200 million masks. Again, France had a company a few years back which was able to turn out 200 million masks a year, but that company was allowed to close in 2008, and then France decided to totally outsource production. So stockpiles have dwindled. EU countries have transferred the responsibility for this kind of contingency planning to private companies or to local authorities without giving them the tools to do so. And therefore, one of the debates today after the COVID-19 crisis is what lessons should Europe learn in terms of repatriating some of these critical supply chains closer to home. Now, EU countries, of course, are not totally bereft in this area. And there have been some interesting examples during the COVID-19 crisis of how production can be switched quickly. For example, Formula One and Mercedes have developed a new respirator. Burberry, the clothing manufacturer, has gone from making expensive raincoats to making hospital gowns. And a company making airline components has turned out visors to protect, of course, faces. But this has been small scale and very late. So what should the EU be doing? Well, in the first place, it can redefine the concept of strategic autonomy away from purely a military intervention capability to covering European self-sufficiency in terms of protecting vital industries and vital technologies. The second thing is that the EU can take on a greater role in health, for instance, in mandating minimum levels of stockpiling in the EU and ensuring that countries are keeping to those minimal levels. It can play, for instance, a greater role in identifying industries that can switch, like car companies, quickly from cars to making respirators, and ensuring that the workforce is trained to do this. It can, which it in fact did at the beginning of the crisis, bulk buy and get good cheap prices and quality control for vital protective clothing on behalf of its members. It can look at creating alternative supply chains, perhaps in countries like Tunisia or Morocco, so it's not wholly dependent on, for instance, China. It can look at producing more pharmaceuticals at home. 20 years ago, only 20% of pharmaceutical components were imported by the EU. Today, that figure is 60 to 80%. It can coordinate cross-border transport and assistance from one EU state to the other. It can also look at combating fake news. Interestingly, today, just this morning, the EU telecommunications lobby has reported that there have been 140 arson attacks against 5G infrastructure in Europe since March, because people have been fed fake news that these telecommunication waves carry the virus, which is completely nonsense. But fake news has to be more effectively combated. And then finally, it can look at foreign direct investment screening standards and and security standards for key for companies. For example, CureVac, a German company which recently blocked a hostile takeover. For example, with a rule that once a foreign power wants more than 10% of ownership, there should be some kind of EU mechanism to screen the vulnerabilities that could result. So coming out of the crisis, one key test for a European recovery plan is not only to get our economies back up and running, but to ensure that the lessons are learned in terms of the EU's capacity for greater resilience in the future. Thank you very much for watching and listening. I look forward to being with you once again next week.